John had always been the busy type. Every morning he rushed out the door, barely grabbing his coffee before heading to work. His days were filled with meetings, deadlines, and errands, leaving him little time for anything else. He was used to the hustle and bustle of city life and preferred it that way. People came and went, and he rarely took the time to notice anyone. His neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where everyone kept to themselves. His house was tucked away on a peaceful street lined with trees. It wasn't much, but it was his sanctuary after long days of work. The people who lived around him were mostly elderly or families with young kids. He often waved at his neighbors out of politeness, but never stopped to chat. It wasn't that he didn't like them. He just didn't see the point in small talk. Then there was Mrs. Parker, the elderly woman who lived next door. She had lived there longer than anyone could remember, and her house looked the same as it always had. A well-kept cottage, with flowers blooming in the front yard and a small welcoming porch. She was the type who would always smile and greet you when you walked by. She'd wave or call out a friendly hello whenever she saw John, but he didn't return the gesture. He would nod, maybe smile back, but he never stopped. He didn't have time for her stories or her offers of homemade cookies. To him she was just another neighbor, one he didn't need to get to know. He kept to himself, and so did she. Yet, there was something about her that John couldn't ignore forever. John never thought much about why he ignored Mrs. Parker. It wasn't personal, really. He just had a lot on his plate. Mornings were rushed, and by the time he got home in the evenings, he was exhausted. The idea of stopping for a chat with her, or anyone else for that matter, felt like a luxury he simply couldn't afford. There was always something to do, something waiting to be checked off his never-ending to-do list. Mrs. Parker would often stand on her porch, waving or calling out to him. Sometimes she'd ask if he needed anything, or if he wanted to come over for tea. He'd smile, nod, and wave her off. Maybe next time, he'd say, but he never actually meant it. It wasn't that he disliked her, but he just didn't see the need. Her friendly words seemed like nothing more than pleasantries. He assumed she was just lonely, with no one else to talk to. In his mind, he'd always justified it by thinking that she was simply passing the time. She was an old woman, after all. What could she possibly have to say that would interest him? Besides, he had his own life to focus on. He had work to do, goals to meet. His friends, even his colleagues, often laughed about the elderly people they'd encounter in their neighborhoods, saying they were all the same, harmless, lonely, and full of stories they didn't want to hear. John never thought much beyond that. He didn't feel guilty about his indifference. Everyone did it, right? It was easier to avoid the extra effort of striking up a conversation, especially when you had so many other things going on. He told himself that one day, when he had more time, maybe he'd talk to her. But that one day never came. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday morning. John was running late, as usual. He grabbed his coat and rushed out the door, barely noticing the sleek black car parked outside Mrs. Parker's house. The car wasn't something he'd seen before, and it looked expensive, but he didn't give it much thought. He was already focused on his busy day ahead. The next few days were similar. Each morning, as he left for work, he noticed that the same black car was there, parked in front of Mrs. Parker's house. Sometimes it was gone by the time he came home, but other times it would still be there when he returned in the evening. It seemed odd to him, but again he didn't pay it much attention. She was an elderly woman, maybe it was a family member or a caretaker. But then things got even stranger. One afternoon, as he came home from work, he saw a group of well-dressed people standing outside her house, talking quietly among themselves. They were dressed in dark suits and dresses, which struck him as unusual for a small, quiet neighborhood like theirs. They looked like they were waiting for someone or something. As he walked past, he overheard bits and pieces of their conversation. Words like honor, legacy, and incredible achievements floated through the air, but they didn't seem to be talking about just anyone. It made him curious, but again he dismissed it. Maybe they were just people paying their respects to an old neighbor who had lived a full life. Later that week, John was startled to see a news crew parked near her house, cameras set up, and microphones hanging. A woman with a microphone was interviewing someone who looked important, her face serious. John had no idea what was going on. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was probably just a local event or some community project. But the more he saw these strange occurrences, the more something about Mrs. Parker began to nag at him. What kind of woman had a news crew visiting her house, and who were all these people with their respectful tones and expensive cars? Something was definitely going on, but he couldn't figure out what. One evening, John was walking back home from work, when he overheard something that stopped him in his tracks. He had just passed Mrs. Parker's house, when two men, standing by her front gate, caught his attention. They were talking in hushed voices, but the words were clear enough for him to hear. "She's done so much for the community," one man said. "It's incredible that she's kept it all so private all these years. We need to make sure her legacy is remembered properly." John's curiosity piqued. The mention of legacy again, and the way they spoke about Mrs. Parker, was unlike anything he'd ever heard. It sounded like they were talking about a major figure in history, not just an elderly woman from his neighborhood. He stepped closer, trying to hear more, but one of the men turned around and saw him standing there. The conversation immediately stopped, and they exchanged a quick, awkward glance before walking away. John felt a sudden rush of guilt. Had he been eavesdropping? It didn't feel right, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had to know more. Later that night, after a long dinner, and a few too many glasses of wine, John couldn't get the conversation out of his head. He decided to look up Mrs. Parker's name online. What was so special about her? Why did these strangers treat her with such reverence? To his shock, he found page after page of articles, news reports, and interviews. Mrs. Parker wasn't just a quiet old lady from the neighborhood. She had been a pioneering scientist in her younger years, known for her groundbreaking work in environmental conservation. There were photos of her standing next to world leaders, accepting awards and speaking at conferences. John sat back in his chair, stunned. He'd had no idea. Mrs. Parker was a legend in her own right, and yet he had ignored her for all this time. The woman he had thought of as nothing more than a lonely neighbor was someone who had shaped the world in ways he couldn't even begin to comprehend. He felt a deep sense of regret. What had he missed by dismissing her? The next day, John couldn't stop thinking about what he had discovered. Mrs. Parker wasn't just an elderly woman who lived next door, she was a trailblazer, someone who had contributed immensely to society. As he sat at his desk, scrolling through article after article, he learned more about her achievements. In her youth, Mrs. Parker had been a renowned environmental scientist. She had founded a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving endangered species, and her research had led to the creation of several international wildlife reserves. Her name had been on the cover of magazines, and she had been invited to speak at major environmental summits across the world. John found it hard to believe that the kind, gentle woman next door was once so prominent in the global spotlight. One article detailed a groundbreaking discovery she had made in her late 20s, something that had revolutionized the way scientists looked at climate change. The findings had earned her numerous accolades, and she had been personally recognized by some of the most powerful people in the world. Yet, she had quietly stepped away from the spotlight in her later years, preferring a quieter life away from the public eye. John read about how she had decided to settle in this small neighborhood, choosing peace over fame, dedicating her life to simple things like gardening, reading, and helping those around her. It was as if the world had forgotten her, or at least had allowed her to fade into obscurity. But it seemed that people in her past, those who had worked with her and admired her, had never forgotten her contributions. The more John read, the more his feelings of guilt deepened. He had thought of her as just another old woman with nothing to offer. He had never bothered to learn who she really was, never taken the time to listen to her stories. He pulled up an old documentary that featured interviews with people who had worked alongside Mrs. Parker. They spoke with such admiration, recalling how she had fought tirelessly for environmental causes, and how her kindness and humility had earned her the respect of everyone around her. Her colleagues called her a visionary, someone whose work had touched the lives of many. John felt a sense of shame wash over him. Here he was, living next to a woman who had made the world a better place, and he had barely acknowledged her existence. All those years of ignoring her, brushing her off, and dismissing her kindness, it suddenly felt like a huge missed opportunity. He had written her off as insignificant, when in fact, she had shaped the world in ways he could never have imagined. His mind was racing. He had to do something. He couldn't just keep living next door to her, and pretending she was just an old lady anymore. It was time to make things right, to show her the respect and admiration she truly deserved. But how? The following day, John couldn't wait any longer. He knew he had to talk to Mrs. Parker. He had to face her and admit his ignorance, not just about her, but about everything he had missed by shutting himself off from the people around him. He felt a mix of anxiety and excitement as he walked across the yard to her house. He knocked on the door, trying to steady his nerves. His mind raced with questions. What would he say? Would she be upset with him? Would she even want to talk to him? The door creaked open, and there she was, as warm and welcoming as ever. Her bright smile made him feel a little less nervous, but he still couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. "Hello, Mrs. Parker," John said, his voice a little shaky. I was hoping we could talk for a bit." "Of course, John," she replied, stepping aside to let him in. Come in, it's always nice to have a visitor." John followed her inside, his heart beating faster with each step. The house smelled of fresh flowers, and something baking in the oven. It was the same cozy, inviting place he'd passed by 1,000 times, but had never truly noticed. As she led him into the living room, he couldn't help but feel a little out of place. They sat down, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Mrs. Parker gave him a kind smile, waiting for him to speak. John took a deep breath, and finally blurted out what had been on his mind for so long. I'm sorry, Mrs. Parker. I've been so rude. I've ignored you for years, and I've never really taken the time to listen to you. I thought you were just another old neighbor with nothing to offer." He winced as the words left his mouth, but I was wrong. I've learned so much about you, about all the incredible things you've done, and I feel terrible for not recognizing how important you are. Mrs. Parker didn't seem upset. In fact, she looked more surprised than anything else. She gave him a gentle laugh, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, John," she said softly, "I never expected you to know everything about me. I didn't want anyone to know, really. It's not why I moved here. I've lived my life, and now I just want to enjoy the peace that comes with being in a quiet place like this." John was stunned by her humility. "But you've done so much, why didn't you ever talk about it?" She paused, as though considering her words carefully. "When you've spent your life fighting for something bigger than yourself, sometimes you just want to step back and let others carry the torch. I've always believed that actions speak louder than words, but that doesn't mean I don't value the people around me." Her words hit him harder than anything he had read online. He had assumed she was just some forgotten relic of the past, but in reality, she had lived her life in a way that most people could only dream of, quietly changing the world without needing any recognition. She had put others first, never asking for acknowledgement. "I wish I'd known," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wish I'd taken the time to talk to you sooner. I've missed out on so much wisdom, so much knowledge." Mrs. Parker smiled again, but this time, it was different. It was warm, understanding. "You're here now, John. That's what matters." She leaned forward, her eyes bright. "I've lived a long life, and I've learned a lot, but there's always more to learn, and I'd be happy to share some of that with you, whenever you're ready to listen." John felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment that would change everything. The feeling of regret started to fade, replaced by a deep sense of connection. He realized that in trying to avoid the small talk and the extra effort, he had missed out on something much more valuable, an opportunity to learn from someone who had lived a life full of meaning and purpose. And now, he was ready to listen. As the weeks passed, John visited Mrs. Parker more often. He found himself looking forward to their conversations, the stories she would share, and the lessons she offered. At first, it felt a little strange to sit and talk with her. He wasn't used to slowing down, or taking the time to listen. But gradually, he began to realize just how much he had been missing. One afternoon, as they sat on her porch sipping iced tea, Mrs. Parker told John about the early days of her career. She spoke about the challenges she had faced as a young woman in a male-dominated field, how she had fought to be taken seriously, and how the obstacles had only fueled her determination. Her eyes sparkled as she talked about the animals she had worked to protect, the jungles and forests she had traveled to, and the lives she had touched through her efforts. John couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration, her resilience, her passion for the planet, and her unwavering belief in doing what was right. All of it was inspiring. He had always focused on his own little world, never thinking much beyond the immediate, but now, he saw the bigger picture. In their talks, Mrs. Parker also shared her wisdom on life in general. She spoke about the importance of kindness, how small acts could ripple out and make a huge difference. She told him that it wasn't always the big things that mattered most, it was the quiet moments, the kindnesses shown to others, that left the deepest impact. John had never thought much about this before. He had been so busy, so wrapped up in his career and goals, that he had overlooked the importance of human connection. "I've realized something," John said one day after hearing another one of her stories. "I've spent so much time ignoring the people around me, thinking I had all the answers, but I was wrong. There's so much I've missed." Mrs. Parker smiled, her eyes soft. "It's never too late to change, John. The key is to recognize what matters, and to make the effort to connect. People need each other. Don't wait too long, or you might miss the chance to truly see them." Her words struck him deeply. He had spent years avoiding people, brushing them off, thinking that work and success were the most important things in life. But now, he understood that it was the relationships we build, the way we treat others, that gave life its true meaning. John made a vow to himself that day. He would stop ignoring the people around him, whether they were strangers, neighbors, or even the people he had known for years, but never truly seen. He would take the time to listen, to connect, to understand. It wasn't just Mrs. Parker who had changed him, it was his new perspective on life. He began to value the quiet moments, the conversations that once seemed like a waste of time. He found joy in simple things, helping others, offering kindness, and listening to their stories. And most of all, he made sure to never take the people around him for granted again. He had learned that it was never too late to change, and that everyone, no matter how quiet or overlooked they seemed, had something valuable to offer.